Hey everyone, welcome to the Dam Music Center Repair Shop. I'm Jordan, I'm the luthier here. Today I wanted to talk to you about this really cool guitar that came in. It came in basically for a restoration, and I wanted to show you not only the guitar itself and the history behind it, but what I had to do to bring it back up into playing condition. Okay, so what we have here is a parlor guitar made by Washburn. It is an 1897 new model. These were made between 1886 and 1905. Really quite amazing little guitars. At the time, they were on par with Martin, even though they were made in more of a factory setting. They were made in Chicago. Based on the serial number of this guitar, I've estimated it to be somewhere around 1900, 1902. So it's about 120 years old. This particular model has an Adirondack spruce top. It has Brazilian back and sides, all solid. The neck is actually made of cedar as opposed to like a mahogany that we would use now. Ebony fingerboard, ebony bridge, bone saddle. And this one actually has something a little bit different. Much like a violin, it has an ebony string nut as opposed to the bone that we're used to, these days. So when this guitar came into the shop, it was in somewhat rough shape. There were some really nice things that were still really pleased to see. The tuners are all original and they're in excellent shape. Really, the structure of the body was mostly intact. The back was separating from the body in quite a few places. It was mostly detached. The neck was hanging on by a thread. In fact, the fingerboard tongue that hangs over the body was completely separated. The bridge was bolted down, which wasn't an original thing that they did, but it was bolted down here on the wings, and the bridge itself was completely warped and separated from the body. I have the original bridge here, and you can look at it and you can see there's cracks going through. The bridge obviously was not fixable. The back had to be re-glued. And looking inside with some mirrors, and I have a little camera that I use, I determined, all the braces inside were separating, especially from the back. The neck obviously had to be taken off, reset, glued back on. The nut was pretty chewed up just from years of strings going through. So they had quite a bit of work to do. There were a crack going straight through the body, a couple of cracks in other places that needed to be repaired. After the initial inspection, I really determined that instead of simply fixing a few things, the guitar really needed a major overhaul. So to begin the overhaul of the guitar, the first step that needed to be done was the neck had to be removed from the guitar. Most commonly, whenever I remove a neck from a guitar, I will remove a fret, I'll use steam, and it heats the glue and softens it and enables the neck to be lifted out. In this case, because the dovetail had broken so much, there wasn't really any of that. It was necessary. It just basically popped right out of the guitar. But I did have to get some steam. I used my steam needle, and I went through the dovetail, and I removed the broken wood, and I was able actually to glue it back onto the tenon part of the dovetail joint that's attached to the neck. And that way instead of having to rebuild that part of it, I was able to just simply use the original wood, which is always a good thing when you're rebuilding a guitar. So after removing the neck, I had to focus then on the bridge, and the hardest part about that was to get the little bolts out that somebody had put in. Obviously the guitar is very small, and my arms are rather large, and so reaching inside there and doing that was a little bit of a trick. However, after getting those out, again, like I said, without those bolts being there, the bridge was pretty much detached anyway. It took a simple little swipe of a spatula, and the bridge popped right off. So now that I had the box with all the parts removed, I was able to get started on the internal bracing before anything else. So the first step to fixing the internal structure of the guitar was to remove the back. As I had said, the back had already been mostly separated from the sides, and so it didn't take much to really go through and break all the old glue out and just remove it. It came off really easily. After doing that, I immediately heated up some hide glue, and I went to my go-bar deck. I clamped all the braces to the back that were lifting up, and they glued together really easily. So while the back braces were being clamped down and the glue was drying, I decided to go through and look at the top bracing to see what can be done. Now these guitars were braced in a certain way that was adequate at the time, but for today's technology with steel strings and everything else, it only had a hybrid bracing structure, which basically meant that you had one cross brace going through the lower bout, and you had another, I'm going to flip it this way, you had another brace going at an angle like this. And so it was a hybrid kind of X-brace system. The problem with this is that the one brace that went across the lower bout also doubled as the bridge plate, which what supports the top and the strings underneath the bridge. And so being made of spruce, the strings would just chew through that real fast. And so you can see it's all broken out and definitely needed to be fixed or replaced somehow. Not only that, it was separating from the top, it was breaking out from the kerf and the inside. As for the little cross brace, it had separated from the top as well, and that part where it had bowed down, it was just completely separated there, and it had started to warp a little bit, and so to really push that down, it wouldn't give much support, especially with newer tension strings on it. So I decided that the best course of action would be to remove these braces and go through and re-brace the whole top in a more modern, like Martin style, where it's an X brace going through a maple bridge plate, treble tone bars or bass tone bars, finger braces going through, bracing across the sound hole, and little finger braces going across there, just to add that extra support, because steel strings are going to be much more tense than the gut strings that would have been common when these were made. So after removing all the extra material from the braces, it was time to put the back and sides together again, reassemble the box and get everything nice and sealed up. So what I did is I just went through and I put spool clamps all around the guitar, and I just worked a few inches at a time to get the glue in, clamp it back down, let it dry. And I just went with a fine little spatula, moved some hide glue in there, clamp it down, and we'll just let that dry over a period of a day or so, just to make sure we're not going to have any explosions when we put it under string tension. So it took a few days just to go through the whole guitar, and I couldn't be happier with how it looks, how it came out. It really sounded nice, putting it together, tapping on it, had a nice resonance to it. So after all of that, it was time to work on the bridge. After putting the box together, the next step was to focus on the bridge. Before doing anything with the actual bridge, I first had to get the top into a condition that can hold a new bridge. Over time, the strings had pulled through the bridge plate, they chewed through the top, and it just left a lot of broken spruce that really couldn't hold glue, it couldn't hold the tension. So the best choice was to go through, and I used a router and a very special routing jig, and I determined just basically where the strings would go through and about where the saddle is. I went through and just routed that spruce out. And I put a new piece of spruce in, fit to that dimension, and glued it on, planed it down, sanded it, obviously with protection around the finish to keep that from getting scratched or marred. And it fit in really nicely and was nice and smooth. And that way, by gluing the new bridge on, I had fresh wood to drill the bridge holes for the pins to go into. I had fresh wood to hold the bridge down itself. And that's going to help transfer vibrations to the top. It's going to help keep the structural integrity together. And generally is just a better way of doing it, as opposed to kind of trying to make it work by using too much glue or anything like that. So in constructing the actual bridge, I wanted to make it as close to the original as possible. There are a few things I changed, mainly just to make sure the bridge doesn't crack anymore like this one did. And what I did is I went through, I got a piece of ebony, and I determined how long I'm going to make it. I made a little bit oversized just to cover up some of the spots where the finish had chipped away. And I went through and I just basically put them next to each other with the old one and just copied my line straight across. I wanted to get a definite string spacing. This one was just a little, inaccurate for how the neck sits. So I went through, I found a new string spacing. And again, I wanted to make it a little bit oversized, so I had a little bit more room just to intonate the guitar and have it play a little bit better in tune. So after copying all my lines, I took the template that I made for it, put it on my new piece of ebony, and first things first, went through and drilled the bridge pin holes. After those were drilled, I knew where my center line was, and I went through and got the topographical part of it down, cut pieces out with a bandsaw, and mostly did all of it by hand. I used a chisel to go through and get the edges of the pyramids down. I used a spindle sander just to go through and cut the curves and make sure they're nice and uniform. Checked all the dimensions with a caliper, try to get it down to as close as possible, make it as symmetrical as possible. And it came out looking fantastic. I went through and rounded some of the lines and just made it to where it didn't look too new, that kind of still fit the instrument a little bit, had an aged look to it. But the main difference, this has a slant going this way, and it's very thin going where the bridge pin holes are. And I decided to make mine the same height. That way there's just more wood to kind of help that lateral pressure against the saddle. We don't want to have any cracking, bridges or anything like that in the next few years. We don't want to have that at all. And I shifted where the saddle was a little bit more to the middle of the bridge as opposed to the very front end, again, just to keep it from cracking and breaking apart. After gluing the bridge back on the body, I had to determine the new neck angle and re-glue the neck to the body. It took quite a bit to reset the neck. I had to really take off quite a large amount of wood from the neck heel. But the neck angle came out great, and the action is really nice and low, so I'm very, very pleased with that. After resetting the neck and gluing the neck back on, I was then able to go through and cut the saddle slot in the bridge. So to find the scale of the guitar, you basically go from the nut to the 12th fret, and then you double it, and that's where your saddle goes. So I had to use a drill bit in there to be my makeshift saddle, determine kind of where I wanted to put it, string it up, and check the intonation. I used a 3/32 size saddle, much like a Martin, and I made the saddle just a little bit lower since the strings were so close to, or the string slots were so close to where the saddle is. That way I still have a comfortable string action, and I'm still getting a good break angle over the saddle. So from my center line of my scale, I routed it behind that line, and the scale came out really, really nice. I think any old guitar like this is going to have a few intonation problems, but really I couldn't be happier with how it plays up and down the neck. So I'm very, very happy with how that turned out. And after cutting the saddle slot, it was time to put the strings on. The last thing to do after getting everything else put together, I wanted to keep the original ebony nut, but it still needed some work. It had worn out over 120 years of use, and the string slots were just not really where they should be. So I took the nut out, I cleaned the old glue off, and I put it back in, re-glued it, and I filled each slot with ebony dust and super glue. And I just rebuilt them a little bit, and then I got it to where they're all nice and smooth, and I went through and I was able to recut the slots where they needed to be, but at the depth they needed to be, so that there'd be no open string buzzes and that the action would be uniform across the fingerboard. And so that way I was able to keep the same nut, but just give it a little bit of a facelift. And that way it played better, sounded better, and is going to hold up for a long time.